David sat in the tall grass, looking down at the sheep grazing below the hill. He sat with his back against the cypress tree, strumming his harp. The melody was soft and filled with emotion. The sweet melody seemed to make the grass dance. Slowly, as the sun set behind them, the sheep began to fall asleep. As night came, David sang to the sheep below, "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall want for nothing else but him. He makes me lie down in lush pastures, and he leads me beside peaceful waters. He restores my soul." David's strumming was methodical. Its sound was like sweet incense rising up to the Lord. David continued to sing into the night. "He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, there is no evil I will fear, for you are with me. Your rod and shepherd's staff comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anointed me with oil, and my cup overflows with your blessing." All the sheep had fallen asleep, and David played with unwavering faith to the God of his heart. He looked to the stars and breathed in deeply. With a final note, David raised his voice to the heavens and sang, "Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Amen." David knew that the heart of God was like a shepherd for his sheep. In the quiet and stillness of the night, David connected to his Lord. Yet David did not know that his song to the Lord was prophetic. In his song, David sang of a greater shepherd that would rise and lead his sheep to still waters. He would restore their weary souls and lead them in paths of righteousness. The shepherd would lay his life down for his sheep, and through him they would dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Chapter 22. Do you love me? Regret. This was the sickness that consumed Peter day and night. It was like a knot in his stomach that could not be untied. The memories of denying Jesus flashed in his mind like a nightmare. Although Jesus was alive, he did not have the courage to speak to him when he first appeared. How could I possibly face Jesus after what I did, Peter thought to himself. A gentle wind came in from the Sea of Tiberias. Peter sat on a ledge overlooking the waters. The sun was setting, creating a burnt hue over the glassy horizon. It was perfect sailing weather, and evening was the perfect time to fish. Peter breathed in deeply. He had conceded to the reality he would never be anything more than a fisherman. His dreams of proclaiming the kingdom of God had shattered the night. He sat by the fire and denied Jesus to a little girl. Even if Jesus is alive, he doesn't want to use me, Peter thought. A few yards away sat Nathanael, Thomas, James, and John. Peter stood to his feet and began walking towards the shore. "Where are you going?" John shouted. Peter didn't look back. He waved his hand and yelled, "Fishing!" and continued down the rocks towards his boat. The 4 others joined him. As the sun set over the gleaming sea, the disciples set sail. The 4 other men laughed into the night, sharing stories of Jesus' ministry and dreaming about the future. Peter remained silent, staring at the stars above. He threw his nets over the side of the boat and waited. Nothing. For a few weeks now, Peter had barely caught anything. "I can't even fish," Peter whispered. "What's the point?" He rested his head against the mast. The 4 others were casting nets on their sides of the boat as well. Together they casted, tugged, and recasted. However, none of them were able to catch anything. "What do you think Jesus will do now that he has returned?" James asked the others. "Maybe he will show himself at the temple." "Could you imagine the look on Caiaphas' face?" John chuckled. The rest of them laughed. They speculated throughout the night, wondering when Jesus would show himself again. It all still seemed like a dream. "All I know is that I will follow him to the end," Thomas said. "I'm done doubting. He has proven to be faithful, so I will be faithful in return." Thomas's words felt like a knife in Peter's side. It was too dark for the others to see tears streaming down his face. The boat rocked up and down, and the disciples continued their vain attempts at catching fish. Peter remembered the first time he witnessed the graciousness of Jesus. He had fished all night and caught nothing. Yet Jesus wanted to go out for a catch anyways. Peter obeyed, and that day they caught more fish than the boat could handle. Peter remembered the feeling of shame he felt in Jesus' presence. He was a lowly fisherman. What right did he have to stand before the Son of God? Yet even so, Jesus accepted him and gave him purpose. Peter closed his eyes and allowed the boat to gently rock him to sleep. The sound of creaking wood and splashing water was a familiar lullaby. That night, Peter dreamed of Jesus. He remembered the smile on his face when he hauled in the last catch. He remembered the flashes of Jesus' glory on the mountain of transfiguration. In Peter's heart of hearts, he longed to be restored to Jesus' side once again. But there was still far too much shame holding him captive. Dawn was breaking, and Peter awoke to the gulls flying overhead. The morning light was ascending over the east side of the sea, breaking up the morning fog. Peter rose to his feet and checked the nets. Still no fish. He ran his fingers through his hair, tying it back into a knot. Peter rolled up his sleeves and brought the nets back into the boat. The other disciples woke up shortly after and began to row back to shore. Just 100 yards away from the beach, Thomas could see a figure waving at them. The sun was behind him, making it impossible to see his face. "My children," the voice shouted, "did you catch any fish?" "No, sir. We toiled into the night and caught nothing. The tide must not have been on our side," James shouted back. "Try again," the stranger replied. "Cast your nets on the right side of the boat. I think you may find some." James rolled his eyes. They were tired and discouraged from a night of no fish. However, perhaps the tide had shifted in their favor. So the disciples took their nets and cast it on the right side of the boat. The water was flat and still. The disciples waited in silence for something to happen. A few moments passed, and Peter was growing frustrated. Just as he was about to grab the nets to pull them back in, he could hear the sound of tugging rope. The men stood back and the nets stiffened and pulled against the side of the boat. The vessel began to lean towards the right, and the men leapt for their nets, trying to tug them back in. Fish filled the nets to the brim. There were so many that the disciples could not even pull them in. James and Nathanael were laughing. Thomas stood over them with his hands on his head in disbelief. However, John was peering at the shore. As the sun rose slightly higher, he could see the figure standing in the distance. John's jaw fell to the ground. He stood to his feet and smiled ear to ear. He pointed to the horizon and shouted, "It's him! It's the Lord!" Peter released his grip on the net and looked out. Standing near the water was Jesus. He wore his familiar grin and waved towards the boat. Peter's heart stopped. He remembered the time Jesus stood on the waters and called out to Peter. He remembered how his gaze left Jesus and he sank to the bottom of the ocean. That is what he did beside the fire the night Jesus was taken. He took his eyes off Jesus. That is why he denied him 3 times. Peter understood now. It wasn't perseverance or skill that would save him. It was fixing his gaze solely on Jesus. Without another second of thinking, Peter dove headfirst into the water. Peter remained underneath for a moment with his eyes closed, having flashbacks of drowning before Jesus rescued him. He opened his eyes and saw the sun peeking through the top of the water. Peter's heart beat swiftly, and he swam to shore. His large arms chopped through the water, and his legs kicked with vigor. He couldn't wait for the boat to be docked. He had to see Jesus. Peter finally made his way to the beach. His clothes were soaked, and it turns out the boat had beat him to the shore. Peter scanned the beach for Jesus. He was sitting by a charcoal fire, waiting for the disciples to bring in the fish. Peter ran to the boat and hauled the net off the boat. Panting with water dripping from his clothes, Peter ran to where Jesus was sitting. He dropped the fish beside him and paused. Peter looked at the fire. He had seen that dark charcoal before. It had a special scent that brought back many memories. The charcoal Jesus used to start the fire was unique. It was the same charcoal used for the fires beside the temple where Peter denied Jesus. Peter stood over the fire for a long moment. His clothes were sopping wet and dripped onto the sand below. "Will you sit with me and enjoy some breakfast, Peter?" Jesus asked. Peter looked Jesus in the eyes and nodded. All the disciples sat down and ate. However, Peter just stared at Jesus, looking for the right words to say. They finished eating silently by the fire. The sun was now high in the sky, yet Peter was still shivering from the damp clothes draped on his back. He was lost in thought, staring blankly at the fire. Jesus looked up from across the coals and said, "Simon, son of John." Peter looked up. It had been a long time since Jesus called him Simon. Jesus looked deeply into the fisherman's eyes and asked, "Do you love me?" Peter met Christ's gaze, the flickering flames reflected in his eyes. "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you," Peter answered. Jesus nodded and poked the charcoal with a stick. "Then feed my lambs," he replied. The black smoke rose high into the air. Peter hated the smell of it. It reminded him of his sins. He could still hear the echoes of the rooster's call in his mind. "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Jesus asked again. This time Peter paused before answering. He considered the question. Did he truly love Jesus? If so, then why did he fall asleep when Jesus wanted him to pray? If he loved him, then why did he deny him 3 times? Peter sighed and thought deeply. He raised his head and looked at Jesus. Although his actions did not fully express it, Peter knew the answer. "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus' gaze did not leave Peter's. "If you love me, then tend to my sheep," he answered. The tension was thick enough to run a blade through. The other disciples merely watched and listened silently as Jesus asked Peter a 3rd time. This time, Jesus' tone was serious and filled with intensity. "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter fell to his knees. Jesus had now asked 3 times, the same amount of times he denied him. He placed his hands in his face and wept. The rest of the disciples listened to the sound of his sobs and the crackling of the fire. Peter looked up to see Jesus' compassionate smile. Peter wiped his tears and nodded his head. "Lord, you know all things. You know my heart, and you know my mind. You have searched me and known me. You know that I love you." Jesus nodded and stood to his feet. He knelt down to Peter and placed his hand on his shoulder. Jesus held it firmly and said, "Then feed my sheep." In that moment, Peter felt the full weight of grace fall upon him like a tidal wave. He breathed in deep and felt the burden of shame melt away. He embraced Jesus and wept on his shoulder. Jesus had restored Peter. Although he denied him, there would be no condemnation for those who loved him. Peter's heart was filled with the Spirit of God. He had finally realized why Jesus died on that cross. His sins were heavy like an anchor on his soul, yet Jesus was able to take it upon himself so Peter would not have to. Peter was now empowered to run without the burden of shame. Jesus helped Peter to his feet and took him alone to the water. Together they walked and spoke as friends. The 2 of them stopped and looked out on the water. They watched as the gulls dove headfirst into the water to snatch up fish. Still looking out, Jesus spoke to Peter saying, "When you were young, you were used to doing as you pleased. You dressed yourself and walked wherever you wanted. You followed your own desires, Peter. Yet now, you no longer have that freedom. You are called by me. That means you will be taken where you do not wish to go. You will be carried out as I was. Will you still follow me?" Peter turned to look at Jesus. He would no longer deny him. He nodded, ready to receive whatever death awaited him because of Jesus. Peter turned back to the fire. John and the other disciples were still eating and talking amongst themselves. "What about John?" Peter asked. "What is his fate?" Jesus looked back at John. His young smile was infectious. Jesus grinned and patted Peter on the back. "My plans for John are none of your concern. He may remain until I return once again. Yet that is not for you to know. You follow me with the gifts and calling I have given you." Peter nodded. John and Peter would both suffer for the sake of Christ. Peter would march up a hill with his own cross and hang upside down. John would be exiled to rot away on an island. Yet before these things would happen, they would see the world forever changed by the power of God's Spirit. They would be called as shepherds to tend to Jesus' sheep. Together they would witness and usher in the beginning of Christ's church. These lowly fishermen from the back country of Galilee would be used to usher in the glory of God Himself. Yet it all began with following the Good Shepherd, Jesus.